I'm J.R. Johansson, and I am here to read a short story that has never actually been published or seen before. So, brand new. It is called Dead Science, and it is about a teacher and a student that are stuck in a high school during an apocalyptic event. So, I will get started. Mr. Blackwell scrolled through advertisements on his phone in the silence of his chemistry lab, trying not to show his resentment of the many sighs from the student who was keeping him at the school on a Friday night. He zoomed in on the selection of duct tape on sale this week, wishing he could have spent his evening there instead of in his school lab. Jade might be one of the few students he liked, but anyone who kept him at school this late would get on his nerves. Cheers from the football field floated in through the open window. It still surprised him that those people were all here this late to watch kids play a game. He shook his head and checked his watch. Almost 10 p.m. It had to be over soon. Mr. Blackwell understood team spirit and all that, but it just seemed unreasonable to sit in the cold and watch teenagers bang their heads together again and again. He stretched his back, trying to relax a knot in his shoulder. It had been a very long day. His doctor's appointment after school had taken more time than he'd expected. All in all, he couldn't wait to just go home, crawl into bed, and let this day end. The phone in Jade's bag dinged, and Mr. Blackwell frowned. When she didn't move to look at it, he shrugged it off until it went off again, and a third time in a matter of seconds. Phones should be silenced during tests, Jade, he rebuked. I know, she grumbled, sighing again and pushing her black hair out of her face. Without pulling it out of her bag, she reached in and cut the phone off in the middle of another ding. Without looking up, she went back to the test, the studs of the black leather band around her wrist scratching across the desk surface as she wrote. An excited eruption of screams went off at the football field, and he glared at the window. When he glanced back at Jade, he saw that she was doing the same and softened a bit, recognizing his teenage self in her bitter but lonely expression. It's going to get better, Jade. She slowly turned her gaze on him, then deadpanned. Thanks, Mr. B. No one has ever told me that before. My life will be so much different now. Mr. Blackwell chuckled softly as she went back to her test. He had to admit he had that one coming. The screaming at the football field continued, getting even louder. It must have been some play. Jade huffed in obvious frustration at the distracting noise from outside. I'll close the window. He stood and walked over, but his phone began vibrating across the desk. Jade looked up at the phone, then over at him with just a quirk of a smile on her lips. Should your phone be silenced during tests, Mr. B? Damn, sorry. Mr. Blackwell jogged back to grab the phone. She went back to her test, and he scrolled through the blur of text coming through in a group faculty chat. None of them made any sense. There was an attack at the football game? What happened? Stay away from the school. It's like hell on earth. God help us. Get out of town if you can. Do it now. He scanned through again to see if he'd missed something, as a chill of fear made his heart race. A terrifying scream came from just below the second-story window, and he slipped the phone in his pocket as he walked over to look outside. A frenzied throng of students, parents, and teachers poured out around and over the football bleachers. Many were bleeding and injured. The ones who weren't sprinted away from the rest. He looked down at them in shock, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. What the hell? Jade asked from where she had popped up beside him. Near the back of the crowd, he heard a guttural growling noise and wondered if some wild animal had caused this chaos. The people at the rear of the group moved slower, though. He squinted, thinking that didn't make any sense, until he realized the sound was coming from them. Many of them had blood on their faces, on their hands. He pulled back from the window, feeling panicked and nauseous at the same time. Are they sick? Jade asked. I think so. Call 911. Mr. Blackwell focused again on the growing crowd outside. They looked like zombies. She ran back to her desk, fumbling and dropping her phone as she brought it out of her bag. There's no such thing as zombies. But as bizarre as it sounded, he kind of agreed with her. Blackwell watched as a football player jumped on and attacked someone's injured grandpa, biting into his neck and ear before Mr. Blackwell had to look away. No one's answering, Jade said as Mr. Blackwell closed the window. Screaming people, trying to get away from their friends turned monsters, started pouring into the nearest shelter they could find, the gym doors of the high school, still propped open for a triumphant return of the team. No, he muttered. Can we get out of the building? Jade gripped his elbow tightly with shaking fingers. Already screams were echoing through the halls as some of those infected followed the fleeing inside. For an instant, Mr. Blackwell froze. his brain stalling on the horror happening inside his own school. This place felt like home to him as much as his house ever had, and now there were people killing each other in the hallways, blood on the linoleum floors. I think it's too late for that, and there are still probably more of them outside than in here. Help me lock and barricade the door. Jade leaned against the door as the screams grew closer and closer by the second. As Mr. Blackwell inserted the key to throw the deadbolt, he saw the trembling and hunched shoulders of Mr. Lopez, the German teacher, through the tiny window. He looked over and locked eyes with Blackwell, rushing to pound on the door. "Let me in!" Without thinking, Mr. Blackwell began to nudge Jade aside, but she grabbed tight to his arm. "Don't. There are probably those zombie things behind him." The skin around her faded black lipstick had lost all its color as her mouth pressed into a taut line of fear. "Zombies aren't real, and we can't leave anyone healthy out there." Mr. Blackwell stared at her in surprise. "Why not? What have people ever done that makes them worth saving?" Her face tightened into a pained sneer. Maybe Jade had been struggling with being the new kid in town even more than he'd realized. He rested his hands on her shoulder and looked in her eyes. "Every healthy person that we don't help will just become an infected person that we'll have to hide from or fight to get out of here." She looked from him to where Mr. Lopez stared at them through the window in the door with panicked eyes. Then she stepped aside, muttering, "I still say they're zombies." When Mr. Blackwell opened the door, Mr. Lopez stumbled through, wheezing, as Jade and Mr. Blackwell closed and locked the door behind him. Did you see them?" Mr. Lopez asked, terror-filled eyes impossibly wide. "Yes. What happened at the game?" Mr. Blackwell's hand went instinctively to the lucky roll of duct tape he always kept on his belt. He wasn't sure how it was supposed to help now. He busied himself by sliding the nearest desk over in front of the door and then placing another on top of it. "I don't know. I think it was probably the other team." Jade rolled her eyes. "Of course. No one in Huntsville could ever be involved in starting the zombie apocalypse." Mr. Lopez calmed down enough to look offended. "I don't appreciate that tone, young lady." When Jade shrugged, Mr. Lopez went to stare out the window. Mr. Blackwell's eyes were glued to the door. He could see outlines of the infected moving in the darkness of the hallway. A sudden thud sounded as someone threw themselves against the door. The old wood around the hinges immediately creaked in protest. The deadlock might hold them off for a while, but the glass was thin and the wood flimsy. At some point, by either a bit of intelligence, luck, or brute strength, they would find a way in, and they had nothing to fight them off with. What do we do?" Jade's voice, soft and scared, came from directly behind him. But when Mr. Blackwell turned to face her, she had a steely look in her eyes and had picked up one of the small portable butane Bunsen burners from the closest lab table. She brandished it with such a tight grip that the tiny torch could have been a loaded gun. Maybe they had more weapons here than he'd realized. "Come, help me." He spun on one heel and ran to his supply closet. Jade followed close behind as Mr. Blackwell took stock. He didn't have any sodium-potassium alloy, unfortunately, too dangerous to keep in a high school chemistry lab, and the amount of pure potassium that he kept on hand wasn't enough to create the effect he needed. He spun in circles, looking at the containers and vials on the shelves. He could hear Mr. Lopez muttering to himself as he watched the destruction outside. Reaching down his right hand, Mr. Blackwell tapped 2 fingers on the top of his lucky duct tape roll, willing it to give him the answer. Then his eyes stopped on a large bottle of potassium chlorate. He reached up and gently lifted it down, along with a small vial of sulfuric acid, which he slipped in his pocket. The same thrill went through him that had made him initially decide to study chemistry. His love of science ran bone deep. "Jade, do you have any food in your backpack?" She stared at the chemical with wide eyes. "I think so." She scrambled to the desk, and Mr. Blackwell hoped she hadn't chosen today to stray from her routine. She barely made it through an entire class without snacking on something. Jade tugged a mostly full bag of gummy bears out of the middle pocket, holding them aloft. "This work? Perfect. Bring that over." Jade jogged to his side. Mr. Blackwell pulled out his largest aluminum tubes and 2 sets of plastic lab gloves and aprons. They just needed something to drive back the infected so they could escape. A huge thump hit the door to the chemistry lab, then another, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Mr. Blackwell jumped, and Jade half ducked behind the table. Mr. Lopez didn't flinch. The man had gone silent as the scream still echoed outside. "We could use your help." Mr. Lopez didn't move, didn't turn around. He never lifted his eyes from the door. Mr. Blackwell put on his gloves and apron, then carefully poured the chemical into the tubes. He was sealing the bottle again when he noticed a dripping sound. Stepping back, he quickly checked around the tubes and under the table to make sure he hadn't accidentally spilled. Then, in the silence, he heard it again, this time near the window. A small pool of blood had formed under Mr. Lopez's left arm. A large red stain that Mr. Blackwell hadn't noticed before was spreading down his sleeve. Mr. Blackwell's mouth went dry. Damn it. Jade was right about not letting him in. Handing her the second pair of gloves and apron, Mr. Blackwell kept his tone calm, his voice quiet. Put these on, then go and move the desk away from the door, Jade. What? Just follow my instructions, he snapped, then forced a brave smile. With a wary look, she did as he asked. Mr. Blackwell tucked the bag of gummy bears under his arm, backing away from the infected teacher and toward the classroom door. When Jade slid the desk away, the sound of metal scraping across the linoleum floor brought the pounding outside the door to a halt. Mr. Lopez turned to stare at them. His mouth hung slack, drool oozing from one side. His eyes were wide, bloodshot. He stared more through them than at them as he stepped forward. Jade swore, backing up against the wall. Mr. Blackwell handed her one of the tubes. Opening the gummy bears, he dumped half of the bag in the front pocket of his apron, and the other half in hers. What the? Jade started. I'll lead the way out the door. You come behind me and use this to keep him back. Drop 3 of those gummy bears into the liquid. Do not point it at yourself. It will create a combustion reaction. Hopefully we can use that to keep him away. Mr. Blackwell explained as he moved toward the door. They just needed to get to a car and get out of town, somewhere safe until the CDC could come in and get this contained. A combustion? Jade stuttered, her eyes on Mr. Lopez as he walked closer. Mr. Blackwell interrupted. Imagine that you're pointing the business end of a rocket straight at him. It's not too far off. Reaching in his pocket, he put a few precise drops of acid in each aluminum tube before pulling out 3 gummy bears. Are you ready? Jade blinked twice before she also drew 3 gummy bears from her pocket with one gloved hand. Mr. Blackwell sent a silent prayer to the gods of science that they'd make it through the night alive. Then he dropped the gummy bears into the tube. It immediately erupted. Jade gasped, and Mr. Lopez stopped advancing, at least momentarily. The rapid oxidation sent off a spray of sparks and smoke from the end of the tube, followed by flames. Jade did the same, flinching at the powerful reaction. He flipped the deadbolt and held the tube out in front of him, thinking of Indiana Jones wielding a torch into a den of snakes. Only he wasn't Indiana Jones. He was just a chemistry teacher, and he was in way over his head. The infected on the other side of the door pulled back when they saw the flames. The nearest was one of the football players. Blood smeared across his teeth and lips. Chunks of skin on his neck and arms had turned a greenish black and appeared to be rotting. He shuffled, eyes on the torch. But when his shirt caught flame, he barely seemed to notice, let alone run away like Blackwell had hoped. Knowing they needed to move fast, he grabbed Jade's shoulder. She followed him without a word into the hallway. They pressed their backs against the lockers, heat from the torches making their brows bead with sweat. Damn it, now that he'd seen them up close, he had to admit that Jade was likely right again. The zombies started moaning and growling, growing brave. Jade swung her torch in a wide arch, shouting, "Stay back!" Mr. Blackwell saw a large gap in the group and moved toward it. "Come on." Swinging his torch like Jade had, he sidled toward the gap. The zombies didn't part like he'd hoped, but when he got close enough, their shirts caught fire, and that was enough to distract them. He and Jade slipped through and bolted toward the nearest door to the outside. As soon as the exit came into view, he saw an even larger group of zombies coming in through it. He skidded to a stop, his heart pounding in his ears. The zombies had turned and started toward them. There was no way out. In here, Jade slipped into the nearest door, the cafeteria. He followed, closing the door behind them. To throw the lock on this door required a key that he didn't have. The cafeteria tables and benches spread out before him like a vast obstacle course, but there were multiple entrances and no keys to the locks. Not out here, it's too unprotected. He headed for the door to the kitchens. That door likely didn't lock without the right key either, but one access point was much easier to defend. At least here they had weapons, knives, burners. He remembered they had a closet with cleaning supplies back there as well. He could fight them off. They had to. Stack up everything you can find in front of that door. Before he'd even finished his sentence, Jade was already moving. Mr. Blackwell walked quickly through the kitchen, assessing their supplies and what things were sharpest, most flammable, most dangerous. He found the 2 longest, sharpest knives and brought them to the closet. Grabbing 2 brooms, he unscrewed the handles and used his duct tape to secure the sticks to the hilts of the knives. He would do what he had to. They would not become mindless monsters like the ones he'd seen. As he walked from the cleaning closet, wrapping the last length of duct tape around the newly crafted spears, he saw that Jade had been doing good work. She'd pushed a long, heavy table up against the door and had piled it with everything heavy in sight. Large bags of flour and sugar, heavy crates and boxes. She held a butcher knife in one shaking hand and her now silent aluminum tube in the other. It was useless now that the chemical was all used up, but Mr. Blackwell didn't want to take away anything that made her feel more secure, especially because from the noises in the cafeteria, those in the hall had followed them in. Setting down the spears, he waved Jade over, and the 2 of them barely managed to move a giant, heavy-duty plastic storage bin over between the closest stove and the table. This way the door could only open inches unless someone used a lot of force. The only weak link was the plastic storage bin, but there was nothing stronger or heavier that they could wedge into that space. It would take a lot of force to break it, and if they came to that point, then they'd deal with it. Jade picked up the spear he'd made. What's with the duct tape? Mr. Blackwell glanced down at his belt and patted it with his free hand. It's lucky. Lucky duct tape? She asked, tone more than slightly mocking. It's gotten me out of some tricky situations. He shrugged with a smile. Never question this fact. You can never have enough duct tape. You're bizarre. She shook her head, but the tension in her face seemed to ease a bit. Nothing wrong with that. Something smashed against one of the large metal garage-style doors that separated the serving counter from the lunch line. They were thin but strong, and they were locked in place. There was only one way they were coming in, through the door. The handle turned, and Mr. Blackwell lowered his spear, stepping slightly in front of Jade. The door opened and almost immediately bumped into the table. An angry growl came from the other side of the door. Several thumps sounded, and the door opened a few inches. Jade stepped up next to him, lowering her own spear to match his. Then the door held. The growls and panting became angrier, more frenetic. One of the cheerleaders looked through the gap in the door. Mr. Blackwell couldn't remember her name. Missy something. She'd never taken one of his classes. One of her bright blue eyes was missing, and deep scratches covered the left side of her face. She reached in one arm, but was stopped at the shoulder. She screamed this horrible primal sound, and kept reaching for them. She didn't seem able to understand why she could see them, but couldn't get to them. Behind her, the shadows of bigger forms started hurling themselves at the door, again and again and again. Mr. Blackwell inspected the storage bin. It seemed to be holding strong, so he put his spear down on the table. Jade watched him silently as he looked through the shelves until he found a gallon-sized container of peanut butter and pulled it down along with some packets of honey. "What are you doing?" Jade asked, momentarily distracted from the repeated thumping against the door and Missy's blood-red fingernails still reaching out for them. "It's going to hold them, for now, but we don't know how long we'll be trapped in here. We need to eat. I'm making us sandwiches." He pulled some cafeteria trays out and found the bread, some cartons of chocolate milk, and a couple of pudding containers. Jade watched him with a bewildered expression. There weren't any chairs in the kitchen, so when he finished, he sat down on the cold, warped linoleum floor, placing her tray next to his. Mr. Blackwell patted the ground beside him. "Come eat and rest. We'll be ready to fight when we have to." He took a bite. Despite his show of being brave, fear made the sandwich dry and tasteless in his mouth. Jade hesitated, then sat down cross-legged next to him. They ate silently, trying to pretend they couldn't hear the door slamming against the table every few seconds, trying to pretend they couldn't see a cheerleader reaching through the door for them with her mottled arm, trying to pretend their quiet town hadn't exploded with madness around them. "Math," Jade muttered, so quietly he almost missed the word. "What?" Mr. Blackwell asked. "The cheerleader. Her name's Missy Baker." She looked straight down as she spoke, nudging the last quarter of her sandwich around on her plate. "She was in math with me. Trig. She was smart. Kind of a bitch sometimes, but smart." He lifted his eyes back up to the door. Bloody drool dripped from Missy's mouth. Her one remaining eye stared blankly at him as she and the growing group behind her pounded themselves over and over against the door. One sleeve of her cheerleading uniform was ripped, drenched in blood. It was terrible to see. The smart girl from Trig was clearly gone, which from Mr. Blackwell's point of view was probably a mercy. She surely would have been horrified to witness what she'd become. He wouldn't let that happen to Jade. He couldn't, no matter what. Whatever she was like, she doesn't deserve this. Mr. Blackwell was struck by a heavy wave of loss, wondering how many more of his students now looked like Missy. The stoner who was frequently absent, the brainiac who could just as easily have been teaching the class, the group of girls who annoyed him so much because they wouldn't stop talking. He whispered, "None of you do." Mr. Blackwell swallowed his remaining chocolate milk and popped the last bite of his sandwich in his mouth before checking his phone. It was after midnight. Even though he'd given up on anyone answering at this point, he tried 911 again. It rang endlessly, the noise making a horror soundtrack when combined with the moans of the infected and the continued thumping of the door. Climbing to his feet, he walked back to the drawer where he'd found some dish towels. He grabbed a stack of them and came back to Jade, placing them on the ground beside her. He shrugged off his suit jacket and offered it to her. She looked from it to him, and he thought he noticed her trying not to laugh at the brown tweed material of his jacket. "I'm good." "Use the towels for a pillow, the jacket for a blanket." He held it out again, and this time she reluctantly took it. "I don't know how you can expect me to sleep like this." Jade cast the banging door a wary glance as she had attempted to fluff the stack of towels, instead of looking more comfortable, though. Half the stack fell over. Jade gathered them all into a not too lumpy pile. "You should rest. You don't have to sleep." "Fine, I'll try." "That's all I ask." Mr. Blackwell peeled back the lid on his pudding as he checked the structural integrity of this plastic storage bin. There was an almost invisible crack in the middle of the nearest side, maybe 1 inch long, but otherwise it seemed to be holding up well. The crack was from compression, so he didn't expect it to help much, but Mr. Blackwell believed deeply little duct tape never hurt anything. He placed a long piece, stretching it from one end of the bin to the other, directly over the crack starting point. Jade laid down, but kept her eyes on him. Mr. Blackwell paced the kitchen as he watched the clock on the wall tick fast, matching beats with the crack extending up the side of the plastic, past his lucky tape. 2 inches long, now 3. He fell into a rhythm. The slamming of the zombies against the door was so consistent it faded to more of a stressful background noise to the problem-solving going on in his head. There weren't nearly as many helpful supplies in the kitchen as he'd hoped. The generator in the storage room was full of gasoline, which he'd siphoned out into a large orange bucket. What to do with it, though? They'd left any really potent chemicals back in the lab. They were cornered now. Neither of them would be getting out of here if he didn't come up with a plan. 4 inches. The crack was deeper now. Mr. Blackwell found some styrofoam coolers in one of the cupboards and broke it up into the gasoline, feeling nauseous. This was not a good plan. He knew it wasn't, but they were running out of time. He'd keep looking, but at least this was something to fight back with. Hours passed, with the pounding of the zombies against the door never ceasing, never slowing. Jade had slept fitfully. Mr. Blackwell went to the large fridge and started pulling out shelves and food. He'd just finished when a loud plastic crack rent the air. Jade sat straight up, eyes wide. The door came open enough to let Missy in, but the larger man behind her still couldn't fit. Missy looked surprised to have finally gotten through the door. Then she went straight for Jade. On instinct, Jade held up one of the spears they'd built, and Missy walked straight into it, impaling herself through the chest. It barely slowed her down. She reached for Jade, but the broomstick coming out of her made it so she couldn't quite reach. Frustration only made her attempts more frenzied. Jade scrambled back, terrified. Mr. Blackwell picked up his spear and drove it through Missy's temple. She fell immediately to the side and was still. He was shocked by how little blood there was. Jade stared up at him with wide eyes as he tried to catch his breath over his racing heart. "Thank you," she said. The plastic cracked even further. It was about to give way. Mr. Blackwell retrieved the spears as Jade scrambled to her feet. Then he gestured for her to come to the fridge and pushed her inside. "Wait, what are you?" He stepped on the broomstick, breaking it in half to shorten it, and handed her one of the spears along with a small fire extinguisher. "I've turned off the fridge, so it won't get much colder, but it is still cold in there from before. Don't come out until you can't breathe or are going to die of hypothermia." "No," she furiously shook her head, holding out her hands to stop him from closing the door. "No! There has to be a better way." "There isn't. If there was, I would have found it." The plastic cracked further, and Mr. Blackwell looked down at the tears in Jade's eyes with a sad smile. "When you get out, go find your parents. Work with them to help people. You won't regret it, I promise." "No, please, no," she repeated, but she relaxed the arm blocking the door. Mr. Blackwell took his duct tape off his belt and handed it to her, for luck. Then he shut the door firmly. The split in the plastic bin finally went all the way to the top, and it slid enough to allow the infected to come in one at a time. Mr. Blackwell ran to the metal sheets covering the lunch counter, flipped the lock, and threw them up. Grabbing the orange bucket in which he'd made his own homemade version of a napalm bomb, he backed away. He waited for all the zombies to come close enough for every one of them to be caught in the blast. For a bit of flash, he'd added a final ingredient which would make the flames burn vivid green. Mr. Blackwell never did chemistry halfway. Drawing in one last deep breath, he lit the flame and ignited his final experiment. So that's it. That's my short story. I hope you liked it, and I hope to see some of you soon in the panel that I'll be doing for this conference. I believe it should be listed on the website. On top of that, please feel free to follow me on social media. I'm under @JRJohansson basically everywhere. I also am a Twitch streamer, so you can follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/authorgamergirl. That's me. So anyway, thanks so much, and I hope you enjoyed the story, and I will talk to you later. Bye.